Welcome to Sports CTO Talks. In this series, we would be connecting with technology leaders in the sports industry, where we will simplify sports technology for all. I am Ami, your guide on this journey through amazing mind of tech leaders who are shaping the future of sports. We will dive deep into discussions into the innovations who are driving the industry, from AI to cloud, from cybersecurity to sustainability. If it is sports tech, we are talking about it. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Professor Sam Robertson, a leading figure in optimizing human technology integration in sports. Sam is a researcher, consultant, and director at Institute for Sports Tech Standards, as well as the director of TCG Advisory, where he helps sporting teams, tech firms, governing bodies, and universities collaborate to drive real change. His work spans innovation, skill acquisition, sports analytics, organizational decision-making, and technology strategy. Over more than 2 decades in sports, Sam has partnered with major organizations like FIFA, Australian Football League, Barca Innovation Hub, Kansas City Royals, and many more. There is a long list. I would love to continue sharing about him, but I would welcome you, Sam, to the podcast. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Ami. It's a pleasure to be here, and listening to you say all that up front makes me think maybe I should have been a little bit more focused in my career over the last couple of decades. There's a few kind of random things in there, but thank you for the introduction. Very kind.
Okay, so today, as you would be sharing about integration of human and technology in sports, can you just explain us the basics, like what is integration when we club humans and technology these days, like in this century, and how does where does augmentation start, where does interface end, and everything about it? Just the basics first.
Sure. I mean, if we go back to the start of that question about how we integrate, humans and technology, I think we're all pretty clear on what a human is, but technology in and of itself can be very different, the definitions of that, depending on who you talk to. We could say a pen and paper is technology, but of course, when we talk about it in 2025, when we're recording this, we tend to think of technology as more the digital type. And so when we talk about integration, really, I'm talking about optimization as well. We're trying to make humans and computers work as well as possible together, or human and technology, depending on again, which term you'd like to use. And so this is a really challenging thing because technology is changing all of the time, which is causing our organizations to also change. Humans change a little bit as well, but the reality is at the moment, we're really being dictated to in terms of which technology is coming down the line, rather than kind of telling the tech companies what technology we'd like to see. Although maybe we can talk about that as something we'd like to see moving forward. So we're really busy, and as you might imagine, this touches every single sporting organization. It touches all of us in our day-to-day lives as well. And I guess rounding out my initial response, there's also different theories and different philosophies around what role technology should play in our lives, in our workplaces, in our sporting organizations as well. And so when we talk about integrating, and you mentioned augmentation, and some people would mention replacement as well, that's really where we need to start. We need to start from a position of, well, what do we want this technology for, or these technologies for? And are we comfortable with this augmentation or even replacement? So if we're not starting there, then we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves.
Absolutely. And today, when we are talking about technology, it's all about AI, from past 1 year, 2 years. So how do these automation tools, have they become more accurate, or are they in the process of becoming more accurate to the sports organization specifically? And how do you draw a line between preserving human judgments of coaches, the referees, and AI?
Yeah, and I think this is a really good example of what we just spoke about in terms of AI. There's a lot of different definitions out there on terms of what actually AI is, and I do a lot of work on trying to unpack that for organizations in terms of, sure, there's technical detail that they need to know, but they also need to know the purpose that AI is having. But even more importantly than that is, which technologies is AI actually reliant on? Because I think we all know, without data to access, the AI is no matter what your definition of AI is, it's not going to work or it's not going to have any value whatsoever. So when we talk about the value and the accuracy of AI right now, we've all seen in our day-to-day lives just how useful it can be for improving our efficiency, giving us answers to questions that otherwise would have taken us a long time to work through. Where it's becoming very interesting at the moment is most of the data. I wouldn't say we're running out of data. A colleague of mine I was speaking to about this last week, Patrick Lucy, who works at 𝗬𝗲𝗺𝗵. He's one of the world leaders in computer vision and AI for sport. And he mentioned to me that we're close to running out of kind of publicly available data, which is an interesting phenomenon that I hadn't really thought about. And I think it's correct. Why that's important is moving forward, not just in sport, but outside of sport, is we're going to need to call on enterprise data or data that's behind a paywall or that's locked away within a sporting organization. And that's a real challenge, not only because of just getting access to it, but athletes may not want to give us that data, and there may be privacy and ethical concerns. So that's an interesting position that sport finds itself in right now. And in terms of your question about how accurate it is, well, for a lot of very rudimentary questions and rudimentary problems, it's more than sufficient right now. And we can probably talk about some examples of those. But for very, very big challenges in sport, things like, can we stop injury? Can we build a champion team in certain sports? These are questions that have been challenging for humans for a long time, and AI needs a lot of things to be able to help with those, including good quality data.
Absolutely. So when you were talking about ethical and privacy concerns, so how can standard organizations or companies or governing bodies guard their players or guard the sports ecosystem, that the data is not being misused, or there is no bias in the algorithm? Like, how can that happen?
Well, it's a nasty word that people don't like talking about, governance, because it sounds a little bit boring, but quite frankly, this is the word that is needed in this particular circumstance. And I say this a lot, and I do mean it when I say I often sound quite critical of sports that haven't done good governance of AI to this point. But I think there's a couple of reasons for that. It's moved very quickly, as it has in general society, and it's caught us out a little bit. Second, sporting organizations are not very big. They're certainly not as big as in fintech or ag tech or the medical industry. So we have to cut ourselves a little bit of slack there in terms of the expertise and just the volume of people we have working in organizations. But there's probably not any excuses any longer. We're all aware of this right now, and we need to have people or an individual or multiple people in organizations taking a lead on this. And I think it depends on the sport and the organization about who that role is, but it certainly needs to be someone in the leadership position, not a junior staff member. And in terms of some of the things that you mentioned then around the ethics and the privacy, I mean, these are incredibly challenging areas to work on, particularly when you're talking about across geographical boundaries, where there's different laws in place, across different sports, where there's different cultures in place, and then take into consideration how quick it's all moving as well. It's very challenging, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't address it.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, you are there into the industry from two decades, more than 2 decades. So, can you share real life examples, what you come across, when you have done researches, what is coming out of it at the end of the day when we talk about the integration of human and tech?
It's really complex because there's so many different stakeholders involved in sport, and you would think that they all have somewhat similar goals in mind, but that doesn't tend to be the case. And as we know in life in general, a lot of the time it's the money that pushes progress rather than, say, the pursuit of performance or the pursuit of athlete health. And I think most people, whether at a startup or working at a larger company, they want performance to improve in their sport of interest, and they want athletes to be healthier. That's good for everybody. But sometimes that's secondary to the money, and then other times they probably aren't aware of current practice well enough to actually meaningfully impact. And what I mean by that is we see a lot of apps, we see a lot of companies coming out now that are solving problems that either don't really exist to start with, or they're doing something that maybe got done 20 or 30 years ago, just with poorer quality data or poorer technology as inputs into that problem. And so I think the best example of that right now is in injury. If we look at what would be required, and we take lessons from the medical field, for example, if we look at what would be required to make a meaningful impact on sports injury, and I mean a meaningful impact, as in literally preventing injuries that were definitely going to happen, we would need a lot of things to occur all at once, and technology would be part of that, but it wouldn't be the only part. In fact, it wouldn't even be close to the major part.
Okay.
So until we have these paradigm shifts, these cultural shifts, these philosophical, these theoretical shifts, in fact, then technology will only be making very, very minor incursions into those problems.
Okay. So like when you talk that technology is going to be a very small part, these days a lot of wearable technologies, like it can be biometric sensors or the wearable watches, and there are multiple, devices stuck with on the cricket pitches and multiple things. So what standards of validation frameworks are needed that it is there across the game or across one sport, and like how is authenticity measured?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one that we spend a lot of time, or increasingly a lot of time, on trying to do this, because there is a view from some people out there that different types of technologies should be measured differently in terms of how you would assess their quality. And I don't really agree with that. I think the reality is when you come to sport, there are always different use cases of technology. There's engagement for the fan, there's the commercial implications, there's a broadcast, there's refereeing. But the reality, most of the technologies that are going to be used for that purpose are either going to be improving human performance, whether that's the athlete or the official, or whatever that might be, or they're preventing an injury or improving the health of that athlete. And really, I don't see any other categories. I think anything that we see in terms of what someone might be using for betting, what someone might be using for fan engagement or television broadcast, or via the web, these are all things that were probably interesting or have origins first in something in the performance space. And so when it comes to assessing the quality of that, there's a whole heap of things that are quite dry and scientific around what we would do, the validity and reliability of that technology. Is it accurate? Some of the things we talked about already. Is it clearly stated who owns the data? How usable is the technology? People enjoy using it. But really at the forefront of this, before we even get to any of that, is, does the technology actually have a use in the first place? Does it actually work? Because if it doesn't
Exactly.
work, we
That
can
was my
assess all
next
these policy.
question to you. That
Yeah.
was my next question to you.
Yeah,
So like,
and this is fundamental, and I know it sounds like a very obvious thing, but we see a lot of technology right now being used in sport at all levels. In fact, quite a lot at the lower levels that just doesn't really have a use.
absolutely. So what happens, like there is failure on this tech being developed, there is no, like, there is less of need, or like the tech people are not connected with the sports industry, or like, what is the gap or the barriers, like there is less of trust or there is lack of awareness. What is the reason behind that?
This is a real conundrum, that what you outlined just then, because if we look at the typical sports tech startup, or even a more mature company, they may not have a great connection into a sporting organization. And if they do, it may be through someone who actually doesn't control the hiring or the purchasing of equipment anyway.
Okay.
Even if they do have access to that person, they are likely every single day receiving multiple emails or phone calls or LinkedIn messages around trying to be sold to. Now, it's impossible for that person to do their day job and
Absolutely.
also wade through this. And so what most of them do, which is a shame, but what most of them are forced to do is to just ignore it. And
Correct.
ideally, you end up not doing that. But what tends to happen is that you go with either the technology that you already have, you stick with that because it's easy, or you maybe if you change your technology provider or add a new one, you go with someone that you know, a colleague or something like that. And even if you did have time to assess the technology, you certainly, take time to take those calls, take those emails. You certainly don't have time to assess it formally because that takes time and money. And so this is a real problem because it means it's more of a problem for the tech companies because they are not only getting into sports, but they're also not getting feedback on that product, whether that
Correct.
product's any good or not. On the other side, you could say, is it really a big problem for the sports? Well, it's probably still a problem because they aren't picking up the latest and greatest information. Sport will always progress, but it probably could progress a little bit more if there was a bit more seamless communication there. And so we certainly play a role in trying to bridge that gap. But even with what we're doing, it still doesn't fix the fundamental problem. And I think in order to move forward with this, sporting organizations will need to have someone in their four walls playing that role as someone that's responsible for taking on technology or auditing it or handling it. And some organizations do that, but not very many.
Absolutely. So other than that, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, that's okay.
So, like, other than that, how can the startups or the sports organizations come together and, prepare products which don't get rejected and which are helpful to the sports industry at the end of the day and which can be used on the ground?
Mm. Well, we're seeing some of the more progressive leagues and governing bodies now have their own accelerators or at least their own, in some cases, incubators or some kind of program in-house, which is designed to not only give those companies a bit of a head start in that sport, but also ensure that they're focusing on the right problem or the right project. And I think that helps to an extent, but we probably need more of those as well. And again, this is where the challenges I talked about earlier come to the fore. The fact that if we take a major American sporting league, for example, or sporting governing body, they might have some ability to impact what happens in Europe or Asia or other areas, but the reality is it's not a global entity. And so that's quite challenging. So unless you have a governing body that governs a sport across the entire globe, in let's say cricket or football, you're going to only make a really small impact on that. So there's no simple answer, unfortunately. We're trying to do what we can to help with the standardization part by people understanding, well, if we can develop a standard for you in a certain piece of technology and everybody knows what that standard is, we're all clear on what's required at a minimum level to gain entry into a sport or to be considered a good piece of technology. So obviously, we can't do that by ourselves, though, and there's a lot of other people that we are working with, but we need to work with more to make sure we make some progress.
Absolutely. And when we talk about all these things, at the crux is the data of the athletes, of the teams, of the matches happening, of their psychosomatic, like there is data across. So,
Mm.
like, I just want to understand, like, who should own it? How should the rights of access being shared to other, like, people around them? Like, what is the long term advantage, disadvantages to be handled, the data to be handled?
It's a really tricky question, and because I think there's a human nature element to this component, which is when we see a number or we see something digital on a screen or we see a piece of data, we tend to trust that number, and maybe much more so than when someone tells us something anecdotally. When we see it, it's something unlocks in our brain and we think it's accurate. But so often it's not, and so often it has other issues as well. It might be unreliable. And the reality is this data is being fed into AI models. It's being fed into historical analysis that we're doing. And we're using this to make decisions. And sometimes these decisions, it wouldn't really matter if the data quality wasn't perfect. But for other decisions, it's really, really crucial. And so much so that, even if this data was off just a couple of percent, it would completely change the way in which we're using this and how effective it would be. And of course, it depends a lot on the decision. It could be something we're using for health and medical versus if we're using it for a television broadcast to show where an athlete is on a field of play. It doesn't really matter if that accuracy of that wearable sensor or that computer vision software is a little bit out. So it's very tricky in that sense because, as I said earlier, it's moved very quick and we're kind of playing catch up now. So we almost need to go back and look at old data as well to check the quality of that. And that's extremely difficult to do because, of course, that data is not always stored and accessible in the right way as well. So it's very challenging, and I prefer, whilst there would be use in that, I prefer that we probably have a look forward at this point and to look at what we're doing now and into the future rather than going back.
Absolutely. And in continuation with the data thing, like how does one ensure or an organization for a matter ensure, like, there is fairness, bias is avoided, there is, like less of disadvantage to the underrepresented athlete groups. Like,
Sure.
how can one manage that? Because in reality, it is there. So,
A lot. No, I'm laughing a little here because I am often guilty of getting a little bit philosophical, but I think I would answer this in the same way. There is no analytical model that is used anywhere on a complex problem that is complete. And sport is mainly made up of what I would say complex problems. And what I mean by that is that there's elements of the problem that we don't either measure very well right now or we don't even aware of at all. And so when I've talked about injury, I've talked about performance already. These are two very complex topics.
correct.
So what I mean by that is there's always going to be something missing. And that might be a key physiological marker on a human. Or to your point, it might be an underrepresented group that we don't know how to understand how to work with that athlete because we haven't seen that type of profile before, or we decide not to scout or draft or sign that athlete because of that reason. And that's that bias that's so damaging. And it's for that reason that most people who are aware of this would be very cautious about handing everything over to AI to automate decision making without the use of a human. And I would agree with that, but the part that needs to come before that is actually being clear on what parts of your model are missing, because a lot of people know there's something missing, but they're not actually explicitly stating what that is. So if you're an organization that's using AI for something that could lead to bias, it's good that you're aware of that. But what's even better is if you actually go back to the start and say, okay, what am I missing here? What is going to show up as a bias here? And that's a really challenging exercise because you kind of need everyone in your room coming up with every possibility you could ever come up with. But the reality is, it's an hour or two out of your week. You do the exercise once every couple of years, and away you go. Now, the other advantage of that is if you are clear on what's not in your model, when you are working with a tech company or you're being approached by a tech company, you can very clearly tell them what's missing. So an example I use all the time is in a lot of sports, we see a lot of bias when we're in scouting or drafting or signing players or athletes. We see a lot of bias to physical data because it's very easy to measure that now. And we don't see as much emphasis on psychological characteristics of an athlete, their communication, their leadership, these types of things. But if you're a good organization, you know that's missing. And so when you have a recommendation from your model, from your AI, you can look at that with context of an athlete over here that maybe it doesn't come up or is being biased against, to use your terminology earlier in the model, but their characteristics in the psychological area are so strong that you decide to go ahead and draft or sign that athlete anyway. So this is something that's not new, but it's just constantly needing to be reminded of many organizations as this landscape changes.
Absolutely. And like with this, like, there are a lot of when tech is merged with humans, there are a lot of other things also at hand, like energy consumptions, disposability, like, there is sustainability at the end of the day. and people are talking about it today. So how, like, are there any researches out there which caters to it and people are looking towards it? People are following it, organizations are following it.
There are, but again, I think it comes to your point earlier about the concerted efforts of the governing body, and there are a few out there that are trying to look at this very comprehensively. They're looking at those energy considerations. They're looking at tech use very comprehensively, not just only, I'm really fortunate enough to have worked with FIFA for, the better part of a decade now, and they do get criticized from time to time on certain things, but I think they do a fantastic job of looking at technology use very comprehensively, but also in terms of the equity of technology as well. They are a sport that has to consider they have more member associations or more countries playing football than there actually are recognized countries in the world right now. So they have to consider all of those different lower level clubs that maybe don't have as much money, lower level countries,
Correct.
as well as the very, very wealthy ones. And so that means you're thinking about what you just said then. You're thinking about the energy use, the cost of that. You're thinking about the quality of low cost options for technology. So whilst we're constantly trying to push the boundaries and be innovative and come up with new technologies in the sport at the World Cup and things like this, we're also making sure that these other developing regions still have access to technology as well. And I think that's really exciting because not only is that good for a particular sport, but it's also good when you see a cheaper, low-cost technology put pressure on the established companies. This is a very, very good thing for innovation, and it really keeps everyone fresh and on their toes.
Absolutely. Like with the established governing bodies, things are smoother comparatively. So what are the common obstacles faced in, policy adoption, policy building, policy making? It can be bureaucracy, cost, as you said. And, how can it be overcome? Because you have worked into the industry from such a long time. So, you understand. So if you could explain us.
Yeah, I talk about this a lot, and I've had a lot of private conversations about this as well, but it's that balance between innovation and standardization. And we sometimes see these as not enemies, but as opposites, whereas actually I think they work together because the first thing about just having innovation and no standardization is that we are dealing with elite athletes and we're dealing with their health and their livelihood. And they are not here to be put in a laboratory and have technology tested on them without any guardrails. And I think most people acknowledge that and agree with that, but sometimes our practice doesn't reflect it. And we actually do it without even thinking. We expose our athletes to risk. And that's not just physical risk. That might be some other type of risk as well, in terms of we risk their data being leaked online, or we risk someone taking ownership of their data and using it for commercial gain, which doesn't benefit the athlete. So it's not just physical harm that we're talking about here as well. When it comes to standardization, I'm a big believer, and I say this a lot as well, that standardization is a precursor to innovation. And what I mean by that is if there is clarity across the industry about a minimum standard, at the very least, that any piece of technology in a sport has to reach, everybody's clear on that. They can go away and ensure, and including startup companies, as soon as they come in, they know what they have to achieve. So there's a great clarity and efficiency that comes with that. You know what you need to do. And we have it in other industries. None of us would get on a non-standardized aeroplane because we'd be fearing for the risk of our lives, right?
Absolutely.
So I know it's not as dramatic as that in sport, but the reality is if we have a clear standard, we know where the minimum standards are, we can then get on with trying to differentiate ourselves from everybody else with other things that make our company great or make our technology great. So I think the best companies have a balance of that. There's not many that can continue that though. It's really challenging. When you're starting up, you're moving at a different cadence, and I've seen a lot of companies be acquired in the last couple of years by much larger organizations, and straight away the innovation dries up. it stops because it's all about the bottom line and revenue, and that's dangerous. That's a dangerous strategy because you can get taken over very quickly by your competitors.
Absolutely agree with that. So you have a lot of research background, like you come from that. So in your view, what is missing into the human tech integration, and where should the investment be more focused on? It can be clinical trials or field studies or long-term tracking, multiple things. So what is the need of the hour right now?
Well, I think you mentioned quite a few of them there. I'm just looking at that bookshelf behind me. There's a book on there by a guy called who influenced me greatly, a guy called Don Norman, who was a consultant to Apple in the 90s. And why I like a lot of his work is that he focuses on technology being human-centered. It's human designed and not just to be enjoyed by humans and also to get them using it more, but also to account for their weaknesses, their fallibilities. And I think when we're talking about human technology integration, that's a key part. I mean, the tech needs to fit the human and the organization rather than the other way around. And of course, sometimes that doesn't always work. Sometimes the technology changes the human. And these wherever it is, this thing here right now is perhaps the best example of that. About has changed us in some ways for the best, but also in many, many ways for the worst. So this is the key kind of starting point. And so when it comes to research, this is not a new field, of course, but the usability of these devices. Of course, we know that these disciplines exist outside of sports. People are working in industrial design and these types of areas. But I think we need a very I don't want to use this term because it gets overused in science these days, but a true interdisciplinary approach to sports tech. I am going to use that term because I can't think of a better one, and that's really important. But then, secondly, as you mentioned, these longer term studies, and it's very, very challenging to do this in sport because governments don't fund sports research, and they haven't for a long time. And right now, there's less funding going into sports research than ever before. And any funding that is going into it is certainly not in this area. It's more around participation or gender equity in these types of areas. So uh, that's a tricky thing to win grants for. So whose responsibility is it to conduct that research? Again, I will probably come back to the companies a lot of the time. I know at some point they run out of money and they need to not be considered as R&D entities. They are trying to sell something, but quite frankly, I think the responsibility does lie with them to work with governments, governing bodies, and universities to conduct that work.
Okay. So, I was Googling and I saw that you have written AGI and the current AI limitations, right? So,
Yeah.
what future advancements do you see as the game changers in human tech? It can be real-time feedback matches, it can be adaptive
Yeah.
coaching, multiple things are there. So, what do you see?
It's it's challenging. I mean, the dry answer to that is addressing the things that we look at when we standardize technology. And we put out a document, our group, through the Sports Tech Research Network, led by 𝗂𝗽𝗄𝗺 in Belgium, uh, a sports tech quality framework, which is freely available online, which talks about the aspects of what makes a good, high quality piece of technology. And so when I think about the advancements, I don't necessarily think about hardware. I do think about new applications, some of what I've already spoken about earlier, but I mostly think about addressing these quality aspects from new technology. So to be specific for a moment, I think about interoperability.
Okay.
I think about integration between multiple types of technologies, very seamless integration. So because right now, most sports in the performance area, but also in the commercial area, have hit almost a saturation point. They can't take on any more technology. They could probably take on more data, but they certainly can't take on any more physical technology they need to run. So what do we do? Do we stop taking on new technology? Well, that probably won't happen. And so it means we need to be more selective on what we take. We need to get rid of our old technology, but we need to do that for the right reasons. And so to me, I think technology that can do more as an integrative tool will be really, really popular moving forward. So that's one thing. Latency is another element. I think access to continued real-time data or close to real-time is a game changer. But again, this is something that will happen organically through the development of computing, I think. So yeah, I don't necessarily think we're at this great point right now of revolution. It's probably more evolution of what we've already got.
Absolutely. So, like when we talk about evolution, like what do you see into the sports tech industry into the next 2 to 5 years? Like, immediate and which is very lucrative to the eyes, to the ears, to everybody.
I hope we see greater variation in what sports look like, and I think a lot of sports starting to look quite similar now in terms of how they're structured and how the technologies they use. I think the opportunity with AI is that we can start to look a lot different, and we can actually look a lot different using the same data as everybody else because we can use AI in so many different ways. So I would love to see moving forward that start to happen. I would also love to see moving forward that there is more collaboration across sports and within sports as well. And I think if we use AI properly, we have so much to gain from an efficiency standpoint. There's so many things that people are doing working in sport that could be vastly improved in terms of the time spent on task. And that's before you even get into talking about whether the AI is better at a decision than someone or not. We don't even need to talk about effectiveness, which is what I would term that. Just from an efficiency standpoint, reporting, these types of very mundane activities that people often spend a lot of time on, or trawling through vision, like coaches do a lot of the time, or people working in social media. So if you've got more time, it stands to reason you should be able to use that to focus on those bigger problems that we've talked about today already. So I hope that happens, and I'm sure some organizations will do that. Other organizations won't. Some people always want to sit in meetings all day, and it doesn't matter how effective or efficient AI will make them, they'll find a way to do that. So there's going to be a mix, but what I hope is that is a more variation, or what I'd say is heterogeneity or differences in sports across the board.
Absolutely. That was really interesting. Sam, like we'll move on to the next segment. I have a lot of questions, but we'll move on to the next segment of the podcast. That's the
Sure.
rapid fire questions.
Mhm.
I'll ask you a few questions and you'll have to be quick in answering. It's either one word, one sentence, all right? And you cannot think.
Great, thank you. This will be good.
Okay. So first is one word to describe the future of sports technology.
Collaborative.
Okay. Which will have a bigger impact in sports over the next decade, AI or wearables?
No contest. AI.
Okay. The most overhyped sports tech trend right now.
Oh, that is very difficult. I think there's a lot still to be gained from it, but I think computer vision is a little overhyped right now.
Okay. If you could instantly implement one global standard in sport, what would it be? One sentence.
Something relating to vision, in fact. So the likeness of an athlete and what constitutes an athlete likeness from camera tracking.
Okay. What is more challenging, convincing an athlete or governing bodies to adopt new tech?
An athlete.
Okay. Would you trust an AI coach to pick your starting lineup? Yes or no?
Yep, with great confidence.
Okay. Who's your favorite player of all time?
In which sport?
Any sport. It has to be one.
Yeah, it has to be one. It's not my favorite sport, but he's a guy that influenced me a lot when I was growing up in cricket. A guy, some of your listeners will know, a guy called Dean Jones. He grew up not far from me, and he was a fantastic cricketer in the 90s.
Okay, perfect. We'll move on to the next segment. That's you'll have to answer one question into 30 seconds.
Sure.
What is the role of AI into the human tech integration of sports? Explain it to us.
Well, to progress human performance, quite simply, that's what it exists for, and so it needs to do that in an ethical way, like we've talked about. But quite frankly, if we're boiling it down to one sentence, it is to sustainably and ethically develop and progress human performance.
Perfect. Thank you, Sam, for joining us today and sharing wonderful insights on that podcast.
No problems. It was really fun. Thanks for taking the time.
Absolutely. So everyone, let's stay connected for more understanding on sports and technology. Please share this episode with your friends, family, and especially the people who love sports tech. We'll meet you in the next episode. Until then, stay curious, stay inspired, and keep exploring.
Thank you.